Natalie Bennett of the Green Party, Nick Clegg, Liberal Democrats, Nigel Farage of the UK Independence Party, Ed Miliband, Labour, Leanne Wood of Plaid Cymru, the Party of Wales, Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish National Party, and David Cameron for the Conservatives. And now we go to Nigel Farage.
There are 6 other party leaders on this platform tonight. They may all look different, but actually on some of the big issues that affect this country, they're very much the same. All 6 of them support Britain's membership of the European Union, and most of our laws being made somewhere else. And as a consequence of that, all of them support open-door immigration. Is it any wonder that trust in politics has broken down to the extent that it has? Well, I represent UKIP, and we believe in Britain, and we believe this country should be a self-governing nation. We believe we're good enough to do that. And we also believe that open-door immigration has depressed the wages for ordinary people, made buying houses for youngsters very difficult, made it tough to get a GP appointment, and not been good for this country. We have a positive alternative. Let's have a trade deal with Europe. Let's cooperate with them as friends, but make our own laws. And let's take back control of our borders and put in place an Australian-style point system so we can choose the quantity and quality of who comes to Britain. By doing that, we'll give ordinary working people an even break.
As a 17-year-old student of politics, I would like to ask, how do each of the party leaders believe they'll be able to keep their promises of eliminating the deficit without raising certain taxes or making vast cuts to vital public services?
Well, the question's right. How can anybody believe these promises on cutting the deficit? Because this coalition was put together to reduce the annual deficit to 0. That's why these 2 guys got together. It is still running at 90 billion sterling every year. More remarkably, and what no one talks about, is the national debt, which has been going on for hundreds of years. And in this 5 years, the national debt has doubled from 850 billion to 1.5 trillion. We need to make cuts, and there are some places we can start. We could easily cut £10 billion a year from the foreign aid budget. We could save another £10 billion a year by not paying over money to Brussels every single day. We could end vanity projects like HS2 that will only benefit a tiny number of people, thus saving, by the end of this Parliament, £4 billion a year. And we need to revisit the Barnett formula, because, frankly, English and Welsh taxpayers are getting a rotten deal, and we could save £5 billion a year in doing that. There's a plan and a promise that could be kept.
I back Ed on raising the top rate of tax. I also want to see us invest in the future of our children, not in nuclear weapons. But I take a very clear view. This country cannot afford more cuts in the next Parliament. We need to see spending rise so that we can invest in the things that matter.
I'm sorry. I mean, I'm hearing half the panel saying that we have no economic problems with debt at all, and the other half of the panel saying that they've been prudent in government. Look, there's no question that spending got completely out of control under Labour, and there are many that thought this coalition would bring it back under control. We have doubled the national debt in the course of the last 5 years. Our debt repayment is bigger than our annual defence budget, and that's with interest rates close to 0. We have a massive problem here, and it seems to me that nobody's prepared to admit that what we've done is we've maxed out the credit cards. Yes, there's growth in the economy, but actually at some point we've got a dreadful debt repayment problem. We've got to get real, and we can cut budgets like foreign aid with, I think, popular public support.
You've been balancing the books on the backs of the poor. 79,000...
No, we've actually done it in a balanced way.
The books aren't balanced. We've got a 90 billion deficit. I mean, what's going on here? Can we get real, please?
It's halved. The deficit's halved.
79,000 people.
Thank you very much, Leanne. Thank you.
Here, this is a copy of the letter that Labour left in the Treasury when we arrived in government 5 years ago, and it says, I'm sorry, we've run out of money. That's what happened when Labour were in power, and my fear is if they got in power, they'd do it all over again.
But you've increased
Nigel Farage, let Ed Miliband
more in
here,
5
please,
years than they managed in
Prime
13 years. Isn't that the truth?
No, we have cut the deficit. The amount we
Thank
borrow
you.
every year has come down.
Nigel Farage.
How does that cut the deficit? You've said what you're going to do, and that's fine. The question that we started off with, how can they believe your promises? You have failed in this government to eliminate the deficit. That was your promise. It is running at 90 billion sterling. Tell Johnny, who asked the question, what are you going to cut?
What I would say to Johnny is we are going to find £1 out of every 100 that the government spends and save that in each of the next 2 years.
Funding has been disadvantaged in Wales since 1978, when the Barnett formula was first invented. When your party was in power and had an opportunity to sort that out, you didn't do it. We deserve an additional £1.2 billion in Wales to take us up to parity with Scotland. If you get into government, will you give £1.2 billion to Wales?
Let's just bring in Nigel Farage on that
question?
point, and then I'll come to Nicola Sturgeon. Nigel Farage.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the Welsh negotiated a very bad deal back in 1978, and the canny Scots negotiated a very good deal. But this all has to be rebalanced, because, frankly, English taxpayers are a bit cheesed off with so much of their money going over Hadrian's Wall, giving people no prescription charges and no university tuition, whilst in England they're charged. So there needs to be a rebalancing, and in the future, Scotland should receive less money per capita than it currently does. That would be fair. As I say, I think we should reprioritise government spending. We should put the British people first, and we should worry a bit less about propping up foreign regimes through, a wasted £10 billion a year on foreign aid, which all of them agree to for some reason that's completely beyond me, and really, frankly, costing £10 billion a year net to be a member of the European Union for no trade advantage whatsoever. These are massive savings we could make, and we could actually, some of the concerns about social spending and everything else, that's not where the cuts need to come. Let's stop giving foreign money away.
Thank you, Nigel Farage.
Just to make it absolutely clear, we want to lift aid to 1% of GDP, increase the aid, because we need a more secure, stable world.
As a 63-year-old, I've grown up with the NHS and have recently retired after 30 years of working there. So you can understand I'm strongly passionate about it. My question is this: how will your party ensure long-term funding for the NHS whilst keeping it as a public service accessible to all?
Thank you very much indeed, Terry. And I'll turn first to Nigel Farage.
Well, Terry, like you, I care about the NHS because I've had so many scrapes in my life. I've needed it far more than most people. And I think that when it comes to emergency care, it probably is the best in the world. That doesn't mean there aren't some things that occasionally go wrong. This whole question of how we fund the health service with a population that's rapidly rising, with a population that is ageing, is a huge question. We've had a big internal debate in our party about it, and we've decided the best way to do it is to run it efficiently, to run it as a public service, free at the point of access, but to recognise that there has been a 48% growth in middle management of the NHS since 1997. The Labour Party attempted to privatise large chunks of the health service. That I also don't believe has worked. I'd put an extra £3 billion in from savings to our EU contributions, and I'd stop the tax on illness by ending hospital parking charges. Yeah, I just wonder what everybody thinks about health tourism. Leanne made the point that it was christened the National Health Service, but as we now have a lot of people coming into Britain and using the National Health Service who are not British residents, that is estimated to cost about £2 billion a year. I just wonder, would the panel agree with me that actually it needs to be the National Health Service? And wouldn't it be a sensible thing if, like every other sensible country in the world, we said to foreign workers who come to Britain, you must have health insurance when you come here?
It was the Labour Party that began the process of privatisation in the health service. They introduced PFI schemes and they introduced foundation hospitals as well.
When we took over 5 years ago, the total amount of NHS money devoted to the private sector was 4%. It is now 6%.
Nigel Farage.
My challenge to everybody here was, of course, ignored and brushed aside for chiefly politically correct reasons. Terry wants to know where the money's coming from. And yes, you've got to put money in, you've got to stop money being wasted. I mentioned health tourism. OK, here's a fact. And I'm sure the other people will be mortified that I dare to talk about it. There are 7,000 diagnoses in this country every year for people who are HIV positive, which is not a good place for any of them to be, I know. But 60% of them are not British nationals. You can come into Britain from anywhere in the world and get diagnosed with HIV and get the retroviral drugs that cost up to £25,000 per year per patient. I know there are some horrible things happening in many parts of the world, but what we need to do is to put the National Health Service there for British people and families who in many cases have paid into this system for decades.
Thank you. Leanne Wood.
This kind of scaremongering
No, it's a fact.
rhetoric
It's a fact.
is dangerous.
It's a fact.
It's dangerous, it divides
Well, it's
communities and it creates stigma to people who are ill. And I think you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Well,
for
I'm sorry,
talking in
we've
those
got to put
terms.
our own people first. I mean, would you, Leanne, open it up to 17,000
Nigel.
people, 27,000 people? The question is, how do we fund the NHS? And if up to £2 billion a year is being lost on health tourism, surely that is a very real problem.
As a part of Europe, immigration is inevitable. If you were elected, how would you address the issue of immigration?
We do need strong and effective controls on immigration. We need to make sure people don't get away with abusing the systems that the rest of us pay for. We also need to recognise that in parts of the UK there are a strain on housing and public services.
We do need immigration that's controlled and fair. And in recent decades, it has been too high, and I want to see it come down. Now, we have reduced immigration from outside the EU, not least by putting in place a cap on people coming to work here. But inside the EU, not least because we've created more jobs than the rest of the European Union put together, immigration has been very high.
Well, first of all, in terms of European immigration, we celebrate the free movement of people in the EU.
Nigel Farage.
Well, Joan, I told you at the start they were all the same, that they all agreed, and they do. They all agree they should be part of the European Union. So the answer to your question is, as members of the EU, what can we do to control immigration? Let me tell you, nothing. Nothing. The Prime Minister can talk about benefits. Ed Miliband can talk about benefits. This isn't about benefits. This is about numbers. And we have a total open door to 10 former communist countries and to the Eurozone, where people are suffering very, very badly. I don't blame a single migrant that comes to Britain from Eastern Europe wanting to better their lot. It has depressed wages. It has led to such a crisis in housing. You know, we have to build a new house, one house every 7 minutes, just to cope with current levels of immigration. We need to change our relationship with Europe to one of trade and friendship, take back control of our borders and put in place an Australian-style points system, and 77% of British people want something done.
I've sat around that table in Europe and negotiated for Britain. You can get things done, and I've set out what I want to get done so that we can sort out this immigration issue once and for all.
But Mrs Merkel, who is the real boss in Europe, as we all know, has made it perfectly clear you can negotiate lots of things over the next couple of years, but you cannot renegotiate the free movement of peoples within the European Union, and that is backed up by the Commission President and the President of the European Council and the overwhelming majority of the European Parliament. Do you accept or not that in your renegotiation, free movement is not up for discussion?
I don't accept that. Nigel is basically saying, give up before you've begun. In fact, if you look at my track record on Europe, I said we upped the European budget. People said it was impossible.
David, I'm wondering what world you live in.
I think we all wonder that.
You talk about your negotiating skill in Europe. You made a big stand against the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. You lost by 26 votes to 2.
I think UKIP have shown their true colours tonight. Really, all this immigration rhetoric is all about pulling out of the EU.
We've taken 143 Syrian refugees. I say to you, we should be taking our fair share of those most vulnerable Syrian refugees.
Let me answer that.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Nigel Farage. A debate about human lives, Nigel Farage.
Yeah, quite right. And I was the first person to say we should take some of the refugees from Syria. I understand that. Joan's question, we've forgotten the question here. What as EU members can we do to control immigration? I've said it before, nothing. Nobody else here, even though they're pro the EU, will actually admit that. But can we get some sense of history on this? You know, if you go back even to the 1990s, from 1990 up until 1998, net migration as a measure into Britain was about 40,000 a year. In the 80s, it was lower than that. In the 50s, it was slightly higher than that. The point is this: since World War II, we've operated with net migration into Britain at an average of about 30,000 a year. It is now net 300,000 people a year. It is 10 times anything this country has had to live with since 1945. And what it's meant is for ordinary folk on minimum wage or not very high salaries, their wages have been compressed. It is the ordinary people of Britain that have paid a very high price for the big corporate employers who've benefited
So raise the
from
minimum
low,
wage.
from low
Living wage.
Nigel Farage talks about remember history. I mean, the Farage family were foreigners once.
Well, precisely.
I'm married to a foreigner.
Well,
You're married to a foreigner.
precisely.
But let's be open-hearted, generous-spirited.
Should we control it? Should we control it?
All I'm saying is,
should we control it?
No,
That's
we should
the question.
Stop bad immigration, but don't paint everybody with the same brush.
How? Joan's question is, how do you control immigration as an EU member? Be honest with people.
Well,
we can't.
And what you say,
tell them the truth.
Well, I will tell exactly the
Tell
truth,
them
which
the
is
truth.
that the freedom to move around the European Union should not be the same as the freedom to claim.
That's irrelevant.
Yes, it is not
That's
irrelevant.
This is not about benefits, it's about movement of people.
But your problem is you seem to imply anyone who's foreign who comes to this country is a menace. We simply can't, as a country, we must remain generous-spirited and open-minded to the rest of the world.
You won't admit the truth, will you? The truth is there's nothing we can do.
My priority is not to have an in-out referendum. David Cameron wants to spend the next 2 years deciding whether to exit the European Union, something he doesn't even want to do. He says he wants to stay in the European Union.
Of course he
so,
does.
look, I say there's better priorities for our country, and they'll be my priorities as Prime Minister.
Can we be clear that there would not even be a discussion about a referendum if it wasn't for the rise of UKIP? In 2012, David Cameron was opposed to Britain having an EU referendum, saying it wasn't in our national interest. For people out there that want a referendum, the only way it's going to happen, freely and fairly, is put enough UKIP MPs into Westminster.
So the Green Party does support a referendum on Europe, but we would be campaigning very strongly in that referendum to stay in Europe.
The one thing that I would agree with Nigel Farage on, and I never thought I would ever say
I'm looking forward to this. This could be fun, couldn't it?
But you are right when you say that you can't control immigration from within the EU as a member.
One honest member of the panel. Well done.
You have to accept that people will come here. We have free movement of people.
Nigel Farage.
An admission of the truth, that's fine. I tell you, it's very interesting, Leanne, this actually worked rather well. The free movement of peoples, when we were in with countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, roughly similar living standards, roughly similar education and health systems, it didn't really pose any problem. The problem was, irresponsibly, stupidly, we let in 10 former communist countries where the minimum wage, say in Romania, is about a tenth of what it is here. And if you say to people in poor countries they can move to relatively rich countries, they do. The Labour government, and I think Ed's admitted this, got it horrendously wrong on the figures, but we now face the potential of a collapse in the Eurozone, and we have no control over the numbers coming to Britain.
Well, we did.
I'm a 25-year-old graduate with a good job, but my generation as a whole have got it pretty tough. It cost us more than our parents to go to uni, we'll work well into our 70s for smaller pensions, and high rents make saving for our own home difficult, if not impossible. We'll be less well off than our parents, and it feels like we're paying for other people's mistakes. If you're elected, what will you do for my generation to help us feel optimistic about our future?
I think there's a section of young people in this country who are having a fantastic time. Life is great. They're full of optimism. They're the rich. They're the rich. And they're the ones who go to the 7% of schools where their parents are wealthy enough to pay for their education. And they are now dominating politics, the media, the arts, sport in a way I haven't seen before. And their families get richer and richer. And the gap, the social inequality in Britain grows with every single year. By abolishing grammar schools, by abolishing selective education, what we did actually was to pull up the ladder on tens of thousands of young men and women every year who would have done better had they gone to a grammar school. With university education, we encourage lots of people to go to university who actually weren't academic and have come out with debt and would have done better with trade and skills. And to give optimism on housing, well, I've said earlier, we have to build a new house every 7 minutes to cope with migration. Let's cut the numbers and let's have a brownfield building revolution.
UKIP on housing.
Yeah, well, I think this is about demand and supply. Markets are about demand and supply. If you're having to build a new house every 7 minutes to cope with 300,000 people a year net coming into Britain, you have a problem. So that side of it, a government, an independent government, can deal with that and reduce the numbers coming. But we need to build lots and lots of houses. The problem is that developers want to build on greenfield sites. It is cheaper for them, it is better for them. And indeed, changes in the planning laws mean it's actually much easier for them to build on those sites. I think what government needs to do, and I don't always want government to intervene, but I do think here government should supply grants and actually make decontamination of brownfield sites something that is a big opportunity for developers. And we could build 200,000 new houses a year on brownfield sites and solve much of this problem.
The fact is that in the last 40 years, in my lifetime, the world has lost 50% of its vertebrate wildlife.
Thank you very much.
Half of the wild animals have gone.
Nigel Farage.
Fracking then.
Thank you.
Me.
Can we return, please, to the issue about optimism for the younger generation? Nigel Farage.
It's interesting. Our own leaders aren't optimistic. Our own leaders don't think this country is good enough even to make its own laws. What I want to see is a self-governing, self-confident United Kingdom, a country in which we've got pride. And for young people, we're living in a global economy. We've got to forget this obsession with our, frankly, failing in many cases, next-door neighbours in Europe, and let's re-engage with a bigger, wider world, and the best place to start would be the 2.2 billion people that live in the Commonwealth and are our real friends. Let's have a Britain that governs itself and looks outwards to the world.
Thank you.
£46 billion. That is what we as a country will spend next year just paying off the interest on our debts. Just imagine the hundreds of thousands of homes we could build for £46 billion. £46 billion is the same as £700 for every man, woman or child in this country.
Labour had an opportunity
the problem
to
is,
vote
Ed
against
Miliband,
zero-hour contracts and turned down that opportunity in Wales. They voted against a Plaid Cymru amendment to end zero-hour contracts in the care sector. So why should people believe what you say on zero-hour contracts?
Thank you.
But also, I think Leanne makes a good point, because we discovered today there are about 70 Labour MPs that employ people on zero-hours contracts, so they obviously haven't got to the bit about practising where they preach.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our free-flowing debate. There's been a lot discussed here over the last 2 hours, a lot for us all to reflect upon. Before we conclude tonight, I'd like now to invite each of the leaders to make a final and brief statement on why they think you should vote for their party on May the 7th. Nigel Farage.
You see, I warned you at the beginning. I said they were all the same. And what you've seen tonight is the politically correct political class. Oh, they're very keen to be popular on the international stage. They don't understand the thoughts, hopes and aspirations of ordinary people in this country. They are detached. Most of them have never had a job in their lives. What we represent in UKIP is plain spoken patriotism. We believe in this country. We believe in its people. We think Britain can be a lot better than this. But if you want things to be shaken up and to change properly, you've got to put more UKIP MPs in Westminster. We won 2 by-elections last year. We can outshine all expectations on May the 7th. Let's do it.